Like I said, I'll try and keep it fairly short, but there is quite a bit of content to get through. A little bit of background and context to this. There's a lot happening nationally through groups like IARPC, but also internationally. And I've been very involved over the years, as has Ruth and many others, Allison and others, in trying to sort of help, bring together all of these various systems around the world. There are a number of higher level entities and organizations too. For example, the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks program, or SAON. And within that, they have, they have mandates to try and focus on data interoperability and sharing and so on. So one of the groups that is involved in that is the Arctic Data Committee. So that's a joint committee of SAON, but also IASC, the International Arctic Science Committee. I co-chair that along with some colleagues from the Netherlands and Norway. And we've been working a lot with a number of other organizations to try and make progress. So let's see if I can move forward here. We've been doing that in a number of different ways. One that I think is particularly notable is last summer, we had a number of activities, workshops. There was one held in Boulder called the Polar Data Planning Summit. That was soon after followed by the Polar 2018 meeting in Davos, Switzerland. And we took our output and conversations from Boulder and we put it into a group under the Arctic Observing Summit, or AOS. And from that came up with a statement that we submitted to the Arctic Science Ministerial process. And the ministerial was held in October in Berlin. It was the second ministerial, and what we essentially outlined there is a task or an objective, sort of an aspirational set of goals for the community that would be developing an architecture for an international interconnected Arctic data system. So soon after the ministerial, we actually followed up on that. So I'll come back to update you in more detail on that meeting in a moment, but we're seeing this as, a fairly complex system actually that has many different moving parts. So these are just a few that I think are quite important. So we have the community is one part, and that there's a little diagram there that shows a whole bunch of logos, and that's just a subset of the various organizations and entities that are working in our space. Not just Arctic, but also Antarctic and then global initiatives as well. We have the data themselves, so the actual data collections. So that's, of great interest to many of us. We have the infrastructure, so the technology standards, networks, et cetera, that sort of underlie the data or helping us to share it. And then we have, all kinds of different applications. So whether those be sort of processing mediator type applications or visualization, or increasingly we're starting to see, online platforms, et cetera. So this global community, as well as our IARPC community under the Arctic Data Sub-Team, is really touching on all of these things and more. But we're doing it, I think, in a relatively organized way, although sometimes it can get a bit chaotic. Bunch of different initiatives. I'm going to focus at the moment on a community initiative, although it touches on some of the others as well. But at the end of November last year, so the 28th to the 30th November, at WMO headquarters in Geneva, we held a meeting called the Polar Data and Systems Architecture Workshop. So that came out of discussions in Boulder, and before that, we've had a number of meetings over the years, and people were, indicating that we really need to start moving from our discussions into more concrete activities to start understanding the specifics of particular systems and, bringing them all together in this big interoperable system that we're all envisioning. So if you want more information, you can go to the Arctic Data Committee website. And if you don't want to write this down, if you just go to arcticdc.org and then go to meetings and then conferences, you'll find a listing for it there. So that'll give you actually the details of the agenda, as well as the participants list, et cetera. But we had over 40 people attend, 20 different organizations, and representation from 17 nations. Global Cryosphere Watch, which is a WMO initiative, was actually our host for the meeting. They've been very, very active over many years in a lot of this work, and we were very appreciative to them for hosting, and it was really quite advantageous as well because GEO, the group on Earth observations, is actually housed at their headquarters as well. So we had some good GEO participation, as well as I managed to meet with a number of the GEO executive while I was there. So this, as I mentioned, was continuing the work of the Polar Data Planning Summit in May of 2018 and meetings before that as well. I do apologize, I have a door that slams beside me, so you'll get a bit of background noise. And if you want information on that meeting, please go to the same website and you can find out more there. One of the things that we did, which is a bit of background, but I think is important, we talked a lot about the distinction between systems and infrastructure. And so, you know, we throw around a lot of these words quite loosely, and sometimes it's fine, other times it sort of introduces confusion. So there, we're at times having, you know, different perspectives on what infrastructure is, what a data system is, and so on. So there's a report which actually I need to post on the website. I'll post that just after we finish up here, but a summary report where we sort of outline our definition. So the infrastructure, we're really looking at this sort of foundational layer that has, you know, relationships, you know, formal, informal relationships, policies, data standards, other kinds of standards and protocols, norms, et cetera. And then sort of base technical components, you know, right down to the hardware and software that serves the data, but also, you know, base data and so on, and that will support many other systems or applications. And so that's where the systems we're seeing as, you know, more refined or more focused, you know, applications that have defined inputs, outputs, user groups, et cetera, and a well-defined architecture. So the infrastructure is typically a little bit more emergent. You can influence it, but it tends to grow a bit organically over time, and it goes well beyond our community as well. So it involves, you know, the internet as a whole, for example. But systems are a little bit more defined, and they warrant particular architectures and so on. So I think a lot of us are working to develop systems, but depending on infrastructure. And I think we all have probably a stake in both, and some of us focus a bit more on infrastructure and others more on systems, et cetera. So, sorry, there's a slide here. So we also talked towards the end of the meeting a lot about, you know, how do we want to move forward, and we've come up with a little bit of a charter almost of you know, values and approaches that we want to take. So we all agreed we wanted to continue these frequent national and international meetings. We feel that we made a lot of progress. We're tending to be meeting about every 6 months, and that seems to be enough to keep people, you know, moving and on track, et cetera. So really going to focus on trying to keep doing that. We need resources to do that. So a smaller group of us, particularly people who spend a lot of time writing proposals for a living, are going to work on that to try and get, you know, money and other types of resources to help us there. We want to expand the current vision, but, you know, in the long term and the medium term, but, you know, really take off smaller chunks and, you know, build out in smaller increments. And that seems to be succeeding now because we're just biting off small pieces and then working on those and getting, you know, smaller successes, but continued success. Sorry, that should be leverage existing. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel if at all possible. So let's look at what's already out there, whether that be an individual system or whether that be an organization and body and so on. We want to really start promoting this idea of a culture that allocates resources when you're creating or developing your own proposal for your system. You know, try and put some resources in for this collective effort, because sometimes, you know, that's a gap where we all want to do this sort of collective activity, but we don't have the resources. And so in some cases, that'll be a dedicated grant like the Polar Data Planning Summit was. In other cases, it just could be, you know, ensuring that you have some travel money in your own grant, or ensuring that maybe you sort of offer to host a workshop or something like that, et cetera. So I won't go into too much more detail on this, but just that, you know, we want to be inclusive, and that we also want to, we're considering the establishment of It's not really, we've decided now after some discussion, not really an organization, but it's more of a team of people. And apologize for the lack of spaces in the slides there, but a team of people that are really going to focus on raising some of these funds and all of those types of things, because we've had a lot who are very active technically, but fewer people who have been more active in sort of bringing together the community. So the workshop had a series of initial presentations. You can go to the website if you want to look at those. There was summary of recent workshops, as well as overview of selected infrastructures and systems, including the Global Cryosphere Watch, the NSF Arctic Data Center, Arctic Spatial Data Infrastructure, and good presentation by the folks from Polar Research Institute of China and a number of others. So we got started off by just sort of taking a look at what's out there and sort of highlighting some of those systems. We then had two sort of separate working groups. So one of them was focused more on data interoperability, and the other was focused on federated search. So I'm going to start with the data interoperability, come back to federated search. Ruth has been a lead in the federated search, so she may have a few comments to make on that as well. But for working towards this idea of sort of a more comprehensive architecture design, we started with a pre-meeting survey, so we had 18 responses, a few others that I know want to fill that in to complete that even now, and that sort of really highlighted a lot of details about particular systems and infrastructures and what they have in place, what kind of protocols they're using, and so on. What we did is we selected from those the survey responses, and at the workshop we had a group of us actually, you know, sit there with the markers, and we had the flip charts and so on, and just start going into the details of each system. So this is an example of what we created for the Global Cryosphere Watch, and the same infrastructure is also used for Met Norway, Svalbard Integrated Observing System, and the Year of Polar Prediction system. So what we're now in the process of doing is taking the results of those activities and turning them into more formal representations. Initially, we're doing that graphically, like this. So the latest one that we've done this week is the Arctic Spatial Data Infrastructure. And we're also then taking those materials and putting them into a linked open data database that can be used to analyze the system as well as visualize. And we have a tool for visualization that I haven't shown here, but anybody interested, I can follow up with them on that. So we're looking to finish up the documentation, and then I'll come back to this a bit later, but there'll be a more detailed report coming out to go with the summary report that I'll be posting, that I've distributed by email, but I'll also post on the website. So discovery and particularly federated search was a really large focus. It was the main focus at the Boulder workshop, Polar Data Planning Summit. A group of people have been putting together a matrix to document various catalogs that are out there that have a stake in the polar world. And they have been looking at the various protocols, standards, et cetera, that are being used, the service endpoints, et cetera, so that we have a much better idea of, you know, how these catalogs are working towards, you know, better federated search. So we already have some federated search tools out there. Polar Data Catalog is one that Peter mentioned, the Arctic Data Explorer. We also have you know, larger initiatives like GEOS, the Global Earth Observing System of Systems, which has a federated search catalog. But what really came up and was highlighted in Geneva was that Google is now in this game. And so Google now has a data set search. You see the image there. They're using an international standard called schema.org, set of tags, et cetera. We actually had Natasha Noy of Google do a virtual presentation while we were there. So that was really interesting conversation. So Ruth, I suspect you have a few other points to add. So what I'll do is I'll just get through this, and then we can come back during the discussion period if you're wanting to add a few points.
Okay.
Great. So the way forward, this is just some really high-level things. I've already touched on some of them, but We're seeing some of the primary impediments to making, the progress that we want to make. We're making progress, but, some of the impediments to getting where we really want to go is this glue funding to maintain our momentum and so on. We still have some level of uncoordinated effort and fragmentation of initiatives, although I think that's really changed over the years. So we're increasingly, I think, getting most of the organizations that are working in our area around the table, at least, if not actively engaging in these collaborative efforts. We definitely have an issue, and one that we can't easily resolve, but this limited number of mechanisms for international co-funding. So truly international funding, rather than simply saying, we've got a project over here or over there that happens to be going and we'll talk to each other, but actually having money together. So what we want to do going forward is to build on our successful model and enhance it as much as we can. So in terms of the idea of frequent meetings, we have the third Polar Data Forum. I'm going to come back to this in a few slides, happening at the end of this year. I would like to put out the idea here. I put it out in a few other venues, but I'd like to confirm it soon, as the idea of some sort of virtual hackathon or meeting, so that we can continue some of the work that's been done before November. I think November's close enough, but it's far enough away as well. So organizing something along those lines. Reporting on recent activities, again, I'll come back to that, but we have a bit of a backlog because we've been meeting so frequently. We need to sort of write some of that up, and I'm on the hook for a lot of that, but we have sort of a writing committee as well. Some of the things in the future we already have on the schedule are the Arctic Observing Summit 2020. So that happens every 2 years. Last year in Davos, next year it'll be in Iceland. So we're looking at seeing that as a milestone and a place where we can go and present on this ministerial deliverable. The third Arctic Science Ministerial is going to happen in Japan in October of 2020. So we're already working to get put on that agenda so that we can report there. And of course, we want to welcome and cultivate new partners. So we have a lot of partners who've been around for a while. I was talking to a colleague and saying, we actually started working together 20 years ago now, and we're still working together, which is great. A Norwegian colleague, but we know there are a lot of people out there who need to be engaged as well. So the innovation we're working on is this idea of, something that's a bit more of a polar data project, and that would focus a lot on raising resources, but would also work together to try and maybe come up with some sort of focused activity that we could all, connect to, that would help test and develop interoperability and so on. Definitely want to leverage, though. We don't, again, want to create some new entity unless there's a big gap, but to connect things that are already there. Focusing on concrete proposals to achieve the work plan. So we have the deliverable statement, which is fairly detailed, but we also now have a number of different funded projects. So for example, we're looking at the Canadian consortium I mentioned earlier in the meeting, plus the Arctic Data Committee. We've been approached by the T-Mosaic initiative, which is an IASC initiative. So we've just been approached and they said, can you help us out here? Can you help us on data and so on? And so, I'm just about to go out to the community with that invitation and start working with them. So that, I think, will help us because it's really a focused effort, and we have, specific end users and requirements and so on. Funding agencies are now talking about starting an Arctic Funders Forum of sorts. So Attilio, I can't pronounce his Italian last name, I apologize, Giamberti, something along those lines, is going to be leading that, and they'll be having their first meeting in October. And we're looking at trying to get onto that agenda so that we can actually, let them know what we need as a community. And we just want to make sure that all of this is done in collaboration with communities, indigenous organizations, the observing community, folks who are deploying the sensors, et cetera, the science community, researchers, private sector, and anyone else as well, so that we're not off in our silo. And I think we're making some good progress on that. So I'll wrap up in a few slides. The third Polar Data Forum, I'm not going to say a lot about that right now, but it will be the week of 18th of November at FMI, or Finnish Meteorological Institute headquarters, Helsinki, Finland. The idea is to have 2 days, more sort of conference style plenary meetings with 3 days, hackathon or working meeting. And we found those types of, hackathons in Boulder and in Geneva were really, really productive. So we want to make sure that we have time for those who are interested and able to do that sort of work. It's being convened by the Arctic Data Committee, Southern Ocean Observing System, Standing Committee on Antarctic Data Management, World Data System, Global Crowdsource Watch, and a whole bunch of others, but hosted by a number of European partners. So the first Polar Data Forum was in 2013 in Tokyo, Japan. The second was in Waterloo, Canada, co-hosted by NSIDC. This one's going to be in Europe with FMI as the host, but the Antares program, Netherlands Oceanographic Institute, European Polar Board, and others are actually hosting as well. And we want to have general knowledge sharing plus these concrete activities or progress on. Specifically, we've identified continuing the work on federated search, semantics. So the semantics and vocabularies working group is looking at doing some work and maybe doing some educational work there, like training and that type of thing. We're going to continue the data interoperability work, and then confirmation of what I'm putting out is this idea of a responsive strategy. I'm just going to come back to that in my last slide. One point I'd have here is that we have committees are forming soon, so there's going to be a steering committee and an organizing committee. Obviously, the organizing committee will have a number of local people on it, but it's also open to others who just want to help more on that sort of hands-on. If you are interested in participating, please let me know either now or through email or something along those lines, because we'll be organizing our first conference calls over the next few weeks. So responsive strategy, the idea behind this, it doesn't have a formal title yet, but we have a number of things that have happened actually over the last decade at least, where we know a lot about what we need to do, what we want to do, et cetera. Particularly since 2016, there have been about 5 meetings that have really contributed to this, and we have some reporting from all of those. But what I've started working on is trying to take all of those and bring them together into something that's a bit more of a strategic document that really gives us a clear sense of where we want to go as a community, ranging from policy right through to, technical details and so on. The idea is to take what I'll call an ecological information ecology approach. So there are different ways of doing what we'll call business planning or strategy development and so on. And some of them work really well if you're in a nice tight organization. You all work for the same company and you have the same funding and so on. And you can just say, here's our strategy and here's our implementation plan. We don't live in that world, at least when we're talking about international collaboration, et cetera. So there are a lot of really good models that are better suited to these nonlinear sort of emergent adaptive systems, like the internet and the whole sort of ICT community and all of that's emerging there, as well as groups like ours where we're talking about distributed data networks. So that's why I'm referring to as a responsive strategy, is it's something that'll go out as a strategy, but it's going to have to constantly morph and adapt as new things happen, not only within our community, but outside of our community. So this will be a contribution to larger efforts to create a roadmap for the observing system. So Sandy Starkweather of the USAON program and IARPC is leading on that, along with Hayalaikin and a number of others. And we're making sure that this doesn't become our data world is not a silo. So what I just wanted to do is put that out there. It will require lots of effort. Like I said, I'm moving forward on trying to bring together initial drafts and so on, or bringing together the materials, but we'll be looking for authors, reviewers, contributors, even just people who want to say, yeah, this doesn't work for me. So keep that in mind, and I would like to make this a formal activity, or get people's opinions on making this a formal activity under the IARPC ADST that we can revisit periodically, probably at least once a quarter, to develop, with the idea of having at least an initial draft at the meeting in November. So lots in there. Thank you for your time, and I will stop there and open it up to questions and comments. Okay, and if you do want to make a comment, remember to unmute yourself. And Ruth, I had said during the presentation, if you have any comments to make on the federated search, please feel free.
Yeah, mostly I wanted to comment on the schema.org part of that, which is the Google part of that. There are two efforts going on to extend, two major efforts that I know of, going on to extend the schema.org work. One is in the biology community to extend it to genetics and all sorts of things like that. But the other is in the earth science community, and that's being sort of taken up in the United States through the ESIP Federation, though that will have, actually the ESIP Federation is now getting to be international because there's now a ESIP in Australia. But it also is kind of in the Research Data Alliance as well. So there'll be some work on that next week at the Research Data Alliance plenary. So if you're interested in any of those things are happening and everybody's welcome.
Great, thank you, Ruth. Any other questions or comments? And I also notice we now have somebody with a 907 area code with us, and I just wanted to see if they want to introduce themselves.
Hi, this is Peter Kirchner from the Southwest Alaska Network, and one of the hats I wear is I'm the science representative for the long-term data management group for the National Park Service inventory and monitoring, and really interested to hear about your efforts and look forward to learning more about them.
Great, thank you, Peter. And I also noticed Christine Mattia joined. You may want to just quickly introduce yourself, Christine. I don't think I know you. Okay, maybe a mute issue there, but if you want to jump in at some point, that'd be great. Any other questions or comments on any of the content that I put out there? Oh, there we go, Christine.
Sorry about that. I'm slow with the mute button. So I work at NASA headquarters, and I help coordinate all of our activities and participation in IARPC.
Great, welcome. And actually, I think maybe we have connected during reporting periods and things like that. So
probably so. Yep, I help with that too.
Great.
Thanks.
Great. Okay. Any other comments, questions, responses to this idea of any sort of engagement in the Polar Data Forum or the strategy development?
Peter, I'm not sure what the governance and structure of this committee is, and how these things are supposed to be done. I'm speaking just as somebody who's been in and out of these discussions for several years now. It seems like a plausible approach, but I hesitate to make some sort of decree in that. I don't think I'm authorized to do that.
No, well, I think what I'm looking for more for both those, one is the committees are being formed specifically to plan this Polar Data Forum. And having been the chair of the last Polar Data Forum, it's a fair bit of work, but it's also, we just like to have a lot of different perspectives. So you don't necessarily need to respond here, but if you want to think about it, I'd like to nominate some people, and I was going to go through the ADST membership list and send out. So for any of you online, maybe think about it if you receive an email saying, would you like to be part of the steering committee in particular? The steering committee will focus more on, what the agenda will be and what we want to prioritize. Organizing committee will be more the hands-on, planning and so on. So that's both for the Polar Data Planning, the Polar Data Forum in Helsinki. But then for the strategy, said it's great. I can put stuff together, sit down. I've done this for a lot of years, but it really needs to be vetted by our community. So that's a little bit more is if you want to follow this space here, particularly, you know, I'll be using IARPC as a platform as well as the international venues. But if you see a request, it'd be great if I could get people to take a look, provide, you know, feedback, review, and so on. And if you're really interested and able to, under your organizational arrangements, contribute to the writing as well, that would be great. But even just review can be really, really helpful. Great. So if there are no other questions or comments, maybe I'll leave it there. We're about 3/4 of the way through. Peter, you mentioned that you wanted to, you and Alison possibly wanted to highlight some work that you're doing with Above. So now would be a great time to do that.
I'll introduce it very briefly and turn it over to Alison. You may have caught wind that NASA Above has been conducting airborne remote sensing flights since 2017 over the Canadian territories of Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. And unlike doing remote sensing in airspace over the Canadian provinces, the territories require a research permit that goes through territorial boards that get input from Indigenous peoples, you know, over whose traditional lands the remote sensing is being conducted. And we have a requirement as part of that licensing to in some way share data. I don't think there's any need to store data with Polar Data Catalog, but we're somehow supposed to expose the data that were collected under these research permits to Polar Data Catalog. And Alison runs our data archive for the overall Above program, but specifically for the airborne data, which is really all of the permitting for most of the groundwork is not done under this set of permits. So there wouldn't necessarily be a requirement to share all of the Above project's data to Polar Data Catalog, although we could if there's interest. But so that's sort of the requirement, and I brought this up to Alison at one of our recent tag ups.
Great, thank you. That's very interesting, and I'm very interested in that. I work actually quite closely with Nunavut Research Institute, one of the groups that would have provided you with the license, and
right.
You know, a number of different contexts. So, Alison, did you want to add to that?
Yes. So on the NASA side of the Above data management effort, I think we are ready to do whatever we need to do to share data and metadata along the lines that Peter just said. We do publish metadata to a central metadata catalog for NASA using a common metadata standard for NASA, and we have the ability to produce metadata in multiple formats. So I guess one question is, what are the various metadata standards that are in use across this community? And I think that our data center is in a good position that we could share metadata in multiple formats. We're kind of, you know, agnostic to the format. And I'm interested in getting some specific technologies in place to start doing that metadata sharing right away. And that can also inform my efforts on the behalf of DOE's NG Arctic project to also share their metadata with other groups. And so I'm kind of just looking for some specific direction in terms of metadata sharing.
Hi, Alison. This is Alison Gaylord with the Arctic Observing Viewer Development Team, and also I'm with the Arctic Research Mapping Application. I'd be very interested in having a follow-up conversation with you. We've developed and participated in, I guess, the development of a community adoption of ISO for tracking project information and also where observing activities are happening across the Arctic. And we have some documentation on that and would be really interested in trying to ingest some of the data that you're exposing. We have pulled some from the GCMD archive, and we have some of the NG information as well, but it would be great to maybe have a separate call at some point.
And this is Allison Boyer, Allison Gaylord, and I have had conversations on and off through the years of as we've been planning above, and I don't know that we ever succeeded in bringing to fruition any of the good intentions that were expressed on all parties. But this is a little different than the project metadata. Oak Ridge doesn't actually organize the data products that are archived following our, in alignment with the projects that we maintain the record of at the project office. So there are at least two streams.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I realize there's a very different conceptual model in terms of the way we're largely NSF focused, and I've been working with the Alaska Data Integration Group, Josh Bradley, who was on the call earlier with the Arctic LCC as part of that. But I still feel like there's got to be a way that we can capture a little bit more of that discovery level information.
Yeah.
That makes sense, and it's worth having another recap of your data management development from what I've been following from afar. So that would be great.
Well, like I said, I'm ready to start moving forward with specifics and implementing something. So perhaps we need another call with just those that want to talk about the technical details.
So maybe as a point there, when you say immediately, you're thinking like this week, or within a month, or within 3 months, because that can mean different things at different organizations.
I don't think there's anybody breathing down our neck, but Allison is starting to publish. She's well on the way towards publishing data sets that have been delivered from the airborne campaign in 2017. And so there are archive data described with metadata according to this CMR that NASA uses, common metadata record that NASA uses, that could be exposed to harvest by polar data catalog.
So I guess the reason I ask is that we could conceivably organize this meeting around that topic for April. What I'd like to do as well is we have this international group I've mentioned that Ruth is really involved in, I've been involved in as well, that has done this survey of different catalogs and all of the different specifications they're using. I've had a developer actually do a review of technologies, so actual software, some open source, some proprietary, and so on. I think we could bring together a good group who by the end of that could either have clarity for you or at least have a plan on how to move forward, including higher level things like this schema.org, which has not been really big in our community but is becoming bigger and links to things now like Google. And so I think Ruth, potentially we could bring some people in, either yourself or some others who could elaborate a bit on that, because that's something that's relatively new compared to ISO 19115 or whatever.
Right. In fact, the DAC has been doing schema.org for over a year, and it's very helpful for discoverability.
Okay, well, and that's actually good to know, because we're also looking for people who've already implemented, because one thing we came up with in Geneva is that it does need to be extended. to fully meet the needs of the community. And we're trying to make sure that we have as many people who actually have experience in it. NSF Arctic Data Center is doing it as well. NSIDC has done it as well. Let's make sure that we get that into this conversation that's happening at places like RDA and elsewhere, because it'll make it more and more useful. So if that makes sense to people, I'm noting we're coming up on our time here. I could put that out as our agenda and our focus for the April meeting. It'll happen last Thursday-ish of April. I'll get the exact date out.
I would
That sounds great.